What's up, Covalence friends? I've showed you how to create a super solid WebSocket server. I've also showed you how to authorize your apps using both cookies and tokens. And today, we're going to be authorizing our super solid WebSocket server using both cookies and tokens. Let's get right into it. All right, so we're starting off with our WebSocket template repo, and the link to this repo is actually in the description below. But basically, it's a repo that's already set up with a WebSocket server, and it actually already has intervals for pinging the client and the server for dropped connections or closed connections or dead connections, whatever you want to call them. But essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding some authentication to this. So first things first, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go ahead and install a few packages. And so we're going to open up our terminal and we're going to npm i. And I've already installed all of our Node packages, so we're just installing new packages at this point. So we're going to install cookie parser, and at type/cookie parser, there we go. And I highly recommend that you watch. I included a video to my cookies and tokens authentication video in the description below as well. And I highly recommend that you watch that video before actually doing this particular tutorial, only because I go a little bit more into why we do certain things with cookies versus tokens, and also how we're going to be using this kind of hybrid model where we're going to be checking for both like our authorization in cookies and on tokens, right? And so if cookies exist, we're going to be looking there. If not, if it's coming from something like a mobile app, then we're going to be checking for an actual authorization token, right? Or authentication token. It doesn't really matter. But again, we are going to be making sure that we handle both cases, because I think that authorization through cookies is still a good way to do things, right? And so now that we have our cookie parser installed, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new folder called utils. We're just going to create a little utils file right here. So index.ts, and we are going to export a const called cookie secret. And this secret could really be whatever you want it to be. We're just going to call it secret for now. I highly recommend you don't use secret, but this is going to be for both encryption and decryption of our cookies. And we're going to be doing HTTP only cookies. And again, I'm not going to go too much into this. Watch the other video. It's a good one. And again, I highly recommend that you write your server code to handle both. And you know, it's in my mind, it's better to actually have cookies on your web apps and then have tokens on your mobile apps, right? But again, we are going to go ahead and just use that cookie secret there. And we're going to create a function called valid token that's going to take in a string. And this is where you'd actually do your token validation. So if you're using something like JSON web token, you would use the verify function here, and you just verify that it's a valid JSON web token. It's not expired. If you were doing something kind of like an OAuth, you know, access tokens, refresh tokens kind of thing, then again, this would just be your function for verifying that the access token is valid and not expired and all that, right? And so for our case, we're not going to go into, you know, actually encrypting and decrypting tokens. So I'm just going to say, you know, tk equals test. And if our token equals test, after it's been encrypted / decrypted, if it's a cookie or if it's just, you know, an authorization token or that we're sending in, we're just going to make sure that it equals test. And if so, we're going to say good to go, right? All right, so we have our index.ts, we have our utils, and let's go ahead and we're going to just by default kind of go over real quick kind of where the cookie parser normally would go, right? And so typically in our app router here, which is our HTTP server, this is our Express app, we would be kind of importing cookie parser here, and we would then use that somewhere around here. We'd just do a .use cookie parser, and we'd pass in our cookie secret, right? And then this would actually decrypt the cookies on your request headers, and it would put them as an object, and anything that was encrypted would be on signed cookies. Anything that wasn't would just be on just the cookies property, right? And I go into that a little bit more in that other video, so highly recommend, again, you watch that. Now, this routers file is basically done. We're not going to be really living too much within the HTTP router, or at least our API router. We are going to be going into our socket section here, right? So this is where our actual socket server exists. If you haven't watched the video creating the WebSocket template, that's another good one to watch. We go into a little bit more detail into why we do certain things in here. There's also the one on heartbeats that's good, where we actually create this interval. But again, this is essentially the creation of this WebSocket template, right? Let's go ahead and also add our cookie parser in here. So we kind of have a little area already for performing auth. And so that's basically where we're going to be doing this. Now we actually need to import our cookie parser again here. So let's go ahead and import that. That can be at the top here, cookie parser. And then we're also going to need, just to kind of play well with TypeScript, we're going to need to import a few things from Express. So let's go ahead and do that as well. And what we're going to actually import is request and response. And you don't have to do this. We could actually create our own interfaces, but I'm kind of taking a little bit of a shortcut here. So don't get too upset about it, but I'll kind of show you exactly why we're going to be doing this in a second, right? And so basically what we're looking to do is we already have our area here that we want to be performing auth. And so first things first, we're actually going to parse the cookies, and we're going to parse it with our cookie secret. And this actually returns a function because it is middleware. So this is where we actually want to pass in our request res and next, but we don't have request or res, right? And so basically we're going to be kind of spoofing the response. So we're just going to pass in an object here. And then for request, this actually is an incoming message from our HTTP package here. So that's the interface from HTTP. And what we really want to do is, because we're going to be basically parsing these cookies anyway, it's going to create that signed cookie object. And so what we could do is we could just say that this is going to be of type request. Now we could actually just pass this in as request, but we are going to be using quite a few properties in here. And so this might not be best practice, to be honest, only because the fact that it doesn't actually have all of the properties of request, right? And so if we actually wanted to if we wanted to look at like request.query, it wouldn't exist, and that would cause issues. And so it might be more correct to kind of just pass it in like this as request. So it would just kind of be like this, and then we could pass in this as response. And so everything that goes on after this, we want it basically in the next function. So we want it to happen after the cookies have been parsed, right? And so we're going to parse the cookies, and it's then going to basically create our signed cookies object, right? And so in our function here, we can create this variable signed cookies, and it's going to be on here, which is going to basically be request as request. And this is kind of why, if we really wanted to save a little bit of code or make it look better looking, you could make it here. But again, better practice to not do that, because if we actually try to access, request.query in here, at least it's going to prevent us from doing that, right? All right, so we have signed cookies now, and we can say AT is going to be signed cookies.at. All right, and so AT is going to basically be our access token, and this is going to be what we actually want to set in the cookies themselves. And so it's also going to be what we're going to be using as our authorization token as well. So if that doesn't exist, if that cookie does not exist, right, we want to actually look at the headers, right? And so the headers are basically going to have, typically we would look at headers, right? In a normal kind of if you watch my other videos, if we weren't in the cookies, we look at the headers. We'd look for authorization and then, a bearer token type format. But in our case, we actually can't set the request headers on WebSockets. And so we need another way of doing this. And typically what you would do, or at least the way that I've always done it in the past and the way that I recommend doing it, is kind of setting a query parameter on your WebSocket URL. And so if not AT, what we actually want to do is we want to grab a new URL. So const URL equals, and we're going to create this new URL, and it's with request.url. And so now request.url is of type string. So we need to set it as string. But again, if this is not a URL, so what you kind of want to do is you want to say if not AT and not request.url, then you should, let's see if this actually works now. Yeah, okay, the typing fixed that. So you want to make sure that request.url exists, and you say if not AT and not request.url, then what we're going to do is we're going to pass in, you can actually say WS or WSS. The protocol doesn't necessarily matter here. What we're going to be actually looking at is request.headers.host, And honestly, you could put whatever you wanted here. You could even put, google.com. We don't really care so much about this. We're really only going to be looking at the url.searchparams.get, and what we're going to be getting is AT, right? So it's actually going to be looking for a search param called AT, and basically this is just, after the question mark, this would be the property, and we're looking for the value of that, right? So in our query string. And then we can actually look at if not AT at this point, right? Or sorry, this is not what we want to do. We actually want to use our valid token, if not valid token, AT, right? Then what we want to do, make sure it's not, is we want to call basically unauthorized, and we're going to destroy the socket, right? And so here's essentially all of our authorization code. We're looking at the cookies. All right, if the cookie does not exist and the URL does exist, then what we want to do is we want to actually try and grab a query param, and at that point, we're going to pass whatever this value is into our valid token function. Again, this might end up being an asynchronous function. It wouldn't change anything. If it was, basically this would just now be an asynchronous function instead of an asynchronous function. And if it is valid, then we're going to upgrade to our socket, right? And we're going to actually establish connection. Once the connection is established, we don't worry about our actual tokens or anything being passed up, right? So we're only really doing our authorization on upgrade, right? So once the connection is established, we validate that every message sent is going to be valid. And so again, we are only validating once, and then the connection is good to go. So every message sent after that is now officially a validated client. And until you actually close the connection, it is going to remain active and accepting messages. So this is actually all we really need for our socket logic, right? Now, what we want to do is we're going to kind of simulate logging in and actually setting our cookie. And so let's go ahead. We're going to delete this function because it's useless. We can go ahead and leave this function. It's also kind of useless for what we're doing. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to kind of copy, let's copy this twice. And we're going to create a login, not double L, login and a log out route. All right, so we're going to create login and log out. Now in our login, you can actually see almost these exact same functions in the cookies and tokens video, but we're going to make sure that we check credentials, encode a token, and then what we'd actually do is we would set res.cookie, and we're going to set the AT value, and in our case, we're just going to be setting it to test, but typically again, you would actually be setting it to some encoded token. And we're going to make sure that we use the HTTP only as well as sign true. So it's going to actually sign it with our secret that we passed in. And then finally for log out, and make sure we actually send something back. So res.status 200, and then typically you would actually send back the encoded token. But in our case, our TK just equals test, and then we're going to be passing in the same value, right? All right, so we have our login function, and for log out, all we're going to be doing is res.clearCookie AT, res.status 200, and then we're just not going to send anything back. And then a lot of times you'd actually store this value in some kind of configuration file. You want to make sure that that's essentially a global value somewhere. And that's going to be, our access token more or less, right? Because we are referencing it over here as well. So normally you'd have that value stored somewhere. So for instance, if we stored it in here, export const, and it would be, let's just call it AT, right? And it's going to be AT. And well, let's call it AT key, right? So AT key. And in here, you would actually, let's see, in our socket, what we'd be doing is we would be importing that. So we'd be looking at AT key, right? And then here, we'd be setting it to AT key and AT key, right? So that way everything's consistent and we know we're not messing anything up as far as that goes, right? All right, so that looks good. And we have our login, log out functions. Let's go ahead and we're going to go into our front end now. So let's go ahead and pull up our index.html. And we're basically going to just be adding a few buttons in here, right? And so what we want to do is we basically want to create, let's see, we want to have a login and a log out. All right, so let's go ahead and just kind of fill these out, log in, log out. And then we want a final one that's going to be basically another way to open a connection, but we're going to call it just token connection, right? So it's going to be open token connection, and we can just say, give it a different ID. But basically, this is going to be opening a connection relying on cookies, and this is going to be opening a connection relying on a token, right? And that's really going to be the only difference between the two, and we're going to kind of see how that works. So let's go ahead and go into our public app.ts here. And what we're going to do is we actually have to grab our other two buttons. So we had essentially another open, right? We can call this one TK open, and we're just going to add that. And then we have our login and log out, right? And so we can just kind of copy this one twice. And we have login, log out, log in, and log out again, right? All right, so we have all of our buttons now, and we can kind of write our login and log out functions real quick. So let's just go, we're gonna go all the way to the bottom here, and we're just gonna attach those event listeners. So login.add event listener, right? And it's gonna be click, and it's going to be an async function, and we're going to, for login, what we're going to do is we're just going to make a request. We're going to do a fetch request. So we're going to await fetch, and it's going to be slash API /v1/user/login. All right. And that's basically just defined by our router here, the API router, and then we have our user routes. And so that's pretty straightforward. And we can just check if, res.ok. Then we can show message, and we're going to say just logged in, else. Let's show message, and we're going to say login error. All right, and then we're basically going to have almost the identical thing for log out, right? So let's just change log out here, except it's going to be a different route. And these are obviously going to change logged out, and we're going to say log out error, right? All right, so we have our login and log out changed now. The only other thing I would say we probably want to change is we're not really keeping track of this WS. Like, we're not setting it to null if we close the connection. And so if we want to actually send a message or know that we don't have a website connection, we probably want to add an additional thing here. So, oops, wow, that was crazy. Let's say WS, if WS.readyState does not equal, WebSocket.open, then we're going to assume that we have no WebSocket connection. It's really no active WebSocket connection because we probably would have at one point. It would just be in some state of closing or closed. But again, we don't want to be sending a message if it isn't open, right? And so this is just an additional safeguard that I think is valuable for this lab. I don't think I had it in the template, but it is good to have. And so I highly recommend that you add this, and I probably should add it to the template, but I want the code to be the same as what we actually coded in the video. So again, we have this just kind of as an additional check, checking that it's open. If not, we're going to show the message that there is no WebSocket connection. And then the last thing that I kind of want to do is I want to abstract out this WS open, because we now have two ways to open a WebSocket, but it's basically the same logic. And so I'm not going to obviously copy the code. And so what we're going to actually do is we're going to create a function called init connection. And we're actually going to be passing in an optional argument that is going to be our token, right? And we're going to be returning a function. And that's basically going to be our event listener. So we're basically returning this function here. And so we can go ahead and kind of just copy everything that's in here. We're going to cut it all out and paste it back in here. And instead of just actually opening up this new WebSocket, we're going to kind of turn this into a template literal. Wow. And we're going to say, not TK, then it's just an empty string. Else, what we want to do is we want to pass in the actual query string, right? So we're going to say AT equals TK. And so this is going to be the AT value that we're looking for, in our query parameters. And that should satisfy, if we init the connection with the correct token, that should satisfy what we need, right? Now, typically what you'd have to do to get this token is you'd have to send a request to your auth server, and highly likely that your auth server isn't going to be your WebSocket server, or at least I don't recommend that it's the same. In our case, we're doing the login, with the same server. Don't recommend that normally. So, we're not going to actually mimic grabbing the authorization token. Pretend that, there's another server somewhere. You make a fetch request to that authorization server or that auth server, and it would return your token, and then you could pass the token into this init connection and create this WebSocket connection, right? So that would be kind of like the order of operations here. But what we're going to be doing is, instead of this function here, we're going to be calling init connection. Now we're also going to have our WSTK open, right? And this button is going to be adding an event listener, but we're going to actually be initting the connection with test, right? Now, if we init this with another value, we should get an error, So this would be basically the token that we're getting back from our auth server where it is. In our case, we're just using test, and this is just to speed things up a little bit. But that's more or less all we should need, actually. So let's go ahead and run this real quick. So we're going to npm run dev. And once we got our server listening, we can go ahead and pull up localhost 3000. And so I'm going to go ahead and pop open a little console as well. And so we can actually see that, obviously we try and send the message, we get no WebSocket connection. And if we open a connection, we actually get a WebSocket error, right? So this is an authorization error, right? So we don't actually have the right cookies set up. We don't have the right token in place. But if we actually log in first, you can see that we're logged in. If I were to check my application now, you can see that we have a cookie in here called AT. And so we have an encrypted cookie that's HTTP only, exactly like how we wanted it. And more or less, like what that means is that if we send a message now, we haven't opened the connection, sorry. We obviously have no WebSocket connection. If we open a connection first, we actually can establish a connection. So we can now send a message, and we can see that we sent and received the message, right? Now, if we log out, all right, we've logged out. And actually, what I forgot to do is we logged out, but this connection is actually still open, right? And so typically what you want to do in this case is when you actually have a log out function like this, what you can do is you can actually close your connection, right? So you can close the connection, and then you can actually do the request. Now, a lot of times when you log out, you typically will log out and then immediately reroute somewhere else. And so I would recommend just closing the connection. Some people say, you shouldn't close the connection until the logout request is successful because you don't know if you've actually logged out. But in my case, like a lot of the times logging out is kind of like an event-based thing where you just want to kind of clear things instead of actually having to do like handle data or anything like that, right? And so I would suggest closing the connection immediately for something like this, and then handling other possible errors elsewhere. Rerouting if there is an error with this, right, to somewhere where you don't want to go, or somewhere else, in particular. But again, I would always suggest closing the connection immediately, right? So if we go ahead and we pull up our thing and kind of do this again, right, where we try and open a connection, we can't. We log in first, then we open the connection, right? And then we kind of send a message. And then now when we log out, we actually close the WebSocket connection, right? Which is what we want. We want to make sure that connection is closed when we log out, because now if we try and send the message, we get no WebSocket connection. If we try and open the connection, we get WebSocket error, right? So we have no connection right now, but if we open a token connection, right, we're actually logged out. So if I keep trying to open this, it'll always say error. But if I open a token connection, we actually get WebSocket connection established, right? I can send a message. I can send messages all day long, right? Now, I can close the connection, or I can log in or log out, right? But I can close this connection. If I try and open the connection, obviously it is connection closed. Now, if we change this function to basically only show, if we passed in, looking for this, right? We passed in the wrong code, right? If we pass in extra T in there, right? So that this would be an invalid auth token essentially, right? Now, if we try and run this again, if we open the token connection, you can see that we get a WebSocket error, right? So our authorization check is working because if we pass in an invalid token, we still get a WebSocket error, right? So go ahead and fix this real quick. And now when we actually pass in the right token, you can see that we have our WebSocket connection established, right? We can send our message, we can close the connection, we can log in, open the connection, right? Send the message, we're good to go. So basically we're simulating two types of login, where else we're setting cookies and we have our cookie value, right? Right now we are essentially authorized through cookies. And if we log out, this would be kind of like making an auth call to an auth server, receiving the token, and then opening the connection with that token. We now have our WebSocket connection established, and we can now send and receive messages, and we're good to go. All right, so I feel like that was pretty straightforward and easy enough. If there's anything that I kind of didn't really make a whole lot of sense with, or maybe I messed something up, feel free to drop it in the comments below and I'll be happy to explain further. Also, if you guys have any future ideas as far as WebSockets go, or authorization authentication goes, drop them in the comments. We love hearing from the audience. We love making additional videos based off of your feedback. So otherwise, make sure you subscribe. We'll be putting out more videos soon. Check out our merch store in the link below, and we'll see you soon.